Respect is easy to give until someone decides another soul is not worth it. The laughter came first, soft at the beginning, then spreading across the courtroom like a ripple over still water. It was not loud enough to earn a warning from the bailiff, yet it carried the unmistakable sting of quiet humiliation. Every pair of eyes drifted toward the old German shepherd lying calmly beside an aging Marine veteran. Atlas did not lift his head. His amber eyes remained fixed on the worn leather boots of the only man he had ever truly followed. Caleb Rowe sat with both hands resting on a weathered cane, his shoulders no longer as broad as they had been decades ago, yet still carrying the quiet posture of a United States Marine. His neatly pressed navy blazer covered a frame carved by years of service, while silver hair framed a face marked more by time than regret. Beside him, Atlas rested without a sound, his sable coat touched with gray around the muzzle, one ear carrying an old notch that no groomer had ever tried to hide. Together they looked less like a man and his dog than two old soldiers waiting for another mission to begin. Across the polished courtroom floor, the attorney adjusted his tailored suit and allowed himself a confident smile. He was young, polished, respected, and completely certain he already knew how this hearing would end. As he approached the witness stand, he glanced toward Atlas with barely concealed amusement before looking at the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth enough to fill every corner of the chamber. "We are here to decide matters of law, not to entertain sentimental stories about household pets." A few restrained chuckles echoed through the gallery. Someone near the back whispered something that drew another laugh. Caleb never looked around. Atlas never reacted. The attorney continued with growing confidence. "Whatever affection Mr. Rowe has for this animal does not place him above public safety, property regulations, or common sense. At the end of the day," he paused deliberately, turning toward Atlas, "it's just a dog." Silence settled over Caleb's face like winter snow. No anger, no protest. He simply reached down and rested one trembling hand on Atlas's neck. The old shepherd responded with the slightest lean against his leg, as if reminding the Marine that they had stood through far worse storms together. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, stretching long beams across polished oak benches and worn marble floors. Dust floated gently in the light, while the old ceiling fans hummed with slow, patient rhythm. Outside, an American flag stirred in a warm breeze, its reflection flickering faintly across the courtroom glass. Inside, nobody noticed the small metal tags hanging beneath Atlas's collar. Nobody noticed the faded military stitching hidden beneath the leather. Nobody except one man. Judge Harold Whitmore had remained unusually quiet throughout the proceedings. Instead of watching the attorney, his eyes lingered on Atlas. Not on the dog's face, but on the collar. Something familiar caught his attention. Something he had not seen in many years. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. The attorney finished his statement with visible satisfaction, believing the room had already accepted his argument. Then the judge slowly removed his reading glasses, leaned forward, and spoke in a calm voice that erased every remaining whisper. "Before this court goes any further," he said, "I'd like someone to bring me that dog's military service record." For the first time that morning, the attorney's smile disappeared. He turned toward the clerk as if expecting someone to object, but no one moved. Caleb's hand remained on Atlas's neck, fingers resting beneath the thick fur where the old collar had worn a permanent line. The courtroom felt different now. The laughter had vanished, replaced by the quiet scrape of a chair and the slow ticking of the brass clock above the judge's bench. Judge Whitmore studied Caleb for several seconds before speaking again. "Mr. Rowe, how long has Atlas been in your care?" Caleb lifted his eyes. His voice was low, steady, and weathered by years of saying only what mattered. 17 years, Your Honor." A murmur passed through the gallery. Atlas's ears shifted at the sound of Caleb's voice, but he did not rise. "And before that?" the judge asked. Caleb looked down at the shepherd beside him. For a moment, the courtroom faded from his attention, and something older moved behind his pale blue eyes. "Before that, he belonged to the United States Marine Corps." The attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, with respect, the animal's former ownership has no bearing on the present complaint." Judge Whitmore did not look at him. "That will be for the court to determine." The words landed softly, but they carried enough weight to still the room. Caleb reached inside his blazer and removed a small leather folder, darkened at the edges from years of handling. He placed it on the table without opening it. Beneath the courthouse lights, a faded Marine Corps emblem was visible on the cover. The clerk crossed the floor to retrieve it. Atlas watched her approach, his gaze calm but precise, following every movement until she stepped away from Caleb. There was no growl, no tension, only awareness sharpened by habit. The attorney noticed and gave a faint, dismissive breath. Caleb heard it, but his expression did not change. 17 years earlier, Atlas had been a young working dog with strong shoulders, bright amber eyes, and more patience than most men Caleb had served beside. They had met at Camp Lejeune on a cold January morning when frost silvered the training field, and every breath hung white in the air. Caleb had been 48 then, nearing the end of a long career, carrying the kind of grief that never appeared in official records. His closest friend had died from illness the previous summer, and Caleb had stopped speaking about the future. Atlas had been assigned to another handler at first, but the dog refused to settle. He ignored food, turned away from commands, and spent hours watching the fence line as if waiting for someone he had lost. Caleb understood that look. One evening, after the trainers had gone, he sat outside the kennel and said nothing. Atlas came forward slowly, pressed his nose against the wire, and stayed there. No command had passed between them. None was needed. Within weeks, they were training together. Within months, they moved as if guided by the same quiet instinct. Atlas learned Caleb's pace, his breathing, the slight change in his posture when something felt wrong. Caleb learned the meaning of every ear movement, every pause, every glance toward an open door. Their bond was not built through affection alone. It was built through trust repeated until trust became memory. Back in the courtroom, the clerk placed the leather folder before Judge Whitmore. He opened it carefully. A photograph slipped loose and landed on the bench. It showed a younger Caleb in desert fatigues, kneeling beside a dark-coated German shepherd whose posture was proud and alert. The judge picked up the photograph. His face went still. Then he looked from the image to Atlas, and something in his eyes softened with recognition. Judge Whitmore held the photograph beneath the light, tracing the faded date printed along the bottom edge. November 14, 2009. Camp Bastion, Afghanistan. The image had been taken beside a temporary operations tent, where wind pushed fine dust across canvas walls and distant generators hummed through the night. Caleb stood younger and stronger, one hand resting against Atlas's shoulder. Atlas looked barely grown, his dark saddle coat still thick with youth, his ears tall, his amber eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. The judge read the handwritten words on the back. Sergeant Caleb Rowe and Military Working Dog Atlas after Operation Quiet Lantern. His voice slowed on the final words. Caleb's jaw tightened, though his posture remained composed. The attorney shifted beside his table. Your Honor, I fail to see how an old photograph addresses the issue before us. Judge Whitmore lowered the picture. You will. The courtroom fell silent again. Outside, tires whispered over the courthouse pavement, and somewhere in the hallway a door closed with a hollow wooden sound. Caleb looked toward Atlas. The shepherd had raised his head now, as though the name of that distant operation had crossed 17 years and reached him. Operation Quiet Lantern had begun before sunrise on a morning when the desert sky was pale lavender and cold enough to numb exposed fingers. Caleb and Atlas had been assigned to inspect a medical supply route stretching nearly 12 miles between two field stations. It was meant to be ordinary work. Slow, careful, forgettable. Atlas treated nothing as ordinary. He moved several feet ahead of Caleb, nose testing each current of wind, paws landing quietly over the packed earth. Halfway through the route, he stopped beside a narrow service road. No barking, no sudden movement. He simply sat and looked back. Caleb knew the signal. The convoy halted. The drivers waited while Atlas examined the roadside, circling once before returning to Caleb and pressing close against his leg. The route was changed. Hours later, military engineers confirmed that Atlas's warning had prevented the convoy from entering a dangerous stretch of road. No one in the trucks had understood what happened at the time. They only knew the German shepherd had stopped, and because Caleb trusted him, everyone returned safely. That was Atlas's first official commendation. It was not his last. Judge Whitmore turned another page in the folder. The paper made a dry, brittle sound beneath his fingers. 231 completed patrols, he read. 47 confirmed hazard alerts. 6 emergency medical assists. 3 unit commendations. The attorney's expression hardened, but he said nothing. The judge continued. And a final citation for actions during a civilian evacuation near Helmand Province. Caleb lowered his eyes. That memory lived differently inside him. There had been no medals in the moment, no cameras, no ceremony. Only confusion, heat, and families waiting to be guided towards safety. Atlas had worked until his paws were raw and his breathing came heavy, refusing rest whenever another frightened child or exhausted parent remained behind. When the final vehicle departed, Caleb had knelt beside him and poured the last of his water into a dented metal bowl. Atlas drank once, then pushed the bowl toward Caleb with his nose. Even then, the dog had tried to share. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the distance between the bench and Caleb's table seemed to hold more than polished wood and marble. It held a forgotten morning, a desert road, and a debt no legal argument could erase. He looked directly at Caleb. "Sergeant Rowe," he said, his voice no longer merely formal. "Was Atlas present during the evacuation of Outpost Mercy?" Caleb slowly lifted his head. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's hand tightened around the photograph. "Then I believe this court has been discussing the wrong witness." The attorney rose before Caleb could answer anything more. "Your Honor, this hearing concerns an alleged violation at the Hawthorne Veterans Residence. It is not a ceremony for past service." Judge Whitmore turned his gaze toward him. "Then let us discuss the allegation carefully." He opened the complaint and read in silence while the courtroom waited. The case had begun 6 weeks earlier in a quiet neighborhood outside Wilmington, North Carolina, where Caleb rented a modest cottage managed by the residents. The rules allowed service animals, but a new property board had challenged Atlas's status after one resident claimed the aging shepherd had frightened her near the community garden. No one had been harmed. Atlas had not barked, lunged, or left Caleb's side. The complaint rested on a brief moment captured from a poor angle by a security camera and on the testimony of a board member who had already described Atlas as unnecessary before ever meeting him. The attorney represented the property company and had built his argument around one simple claim. Atlas was too old to be working, too large to be trusted, and too ordinary to deserve legal protection. Judge Whitmore looked up from the papers. "Call your first witness." A woman in a pearl gray suit approached the stand. Her name was Margaret Vale, chairwoman of the residence board. She spoke politely, but every sentence carried the careful distance of someone discussing an inconvenience rather than a living creature. She said Atlas made some residents uncomfortable. She said his presence lowered the sense of order. She said Caleb had been offered alternatives, including a smaller companion animal. Caleb listened without interruption. Atlas lay beside him, breathing slowly, his chin resting between his paws. The attorney stepped closer to the witness. "Did Mr. Rowe ever provide proof that Atlas currently performs a necessary service?" Margaret hesitated. "He showed us an old identification card." "An old card," the attorney repeated. "Not a current certification?" "No." "And when you asked Mr. Rowe to remove the dog from common areas, what happened?" "He refused." The attorney turned toward the judge. "There is the issue, Your Honor. This is not about disrespect. It is about a resident placing personal attachment above reasonable policy." Caleb's fingers tightened around the handle of his cane. Atlas immediately lifted his head and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's knee. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Judge Whitmore saw it. So did the court reporter, who paused for half a second before continuing to type. Caleb's breathing settled. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Rowe, does Atlas still perform a task for you?" Caleb looked at the attorney, then at Margaret, and finally at the judge. "Every day." "Describe it." Caleb rested his palm against Atlas's head. "He knows when my balance is failing before I do. He guides me away from crowded exits when the noise becomes too much. At night, when old memories make the room feel smaller than it is, he wakes me before I lose myself in them." No drama entered his voice. That made the words heavier. "He does not remind me of the war. He reminds me that I came home." The courtroom became completely still. Margaret lowered her eyes. The attorney, unwilling to surrender the moment, approached Caleb's table. Yet Atlas is 17 years old, correct? Yes. His hearing is diminished? Some. His eyesight? Not what it was. The attorney glanced toward the gallery, then back at Caleb. So this court is expected to believe an elderly dog can still be responsible for another person's safety? Caleb did not answer immediately. Atlas slowly rose, placed himself beside Caleb's weaker leg, and stood with quiet precision. Caleb released his cane. For 3 full seconds, the old shepherd supported him without command, without hesitation, and without taking his eyes from the path ahead. Judge Whitmore closed the complaint. I believe, he said, the court has just received its answer. Atlas remained beside Caleb's weaker leg until the old Marine settled back into his chair. Only then did the shepherd lower himself to the floor, his movements careful, measured, and dignified. The attorney returned to his table with less confidence than before, but pride still held his shoulders rigid. He gathered several papers and addressed the judge. A brief demonstration does not establish legal qualification, Your Honor. The residents requested current documentation. Mr. Rowe failed to provide it. Judge Whitmore glanced toward the leather folder. The court has documentation. Historical documentation, the attorney replied. With respect, military recognition from years ago does not automatically prove present necessity. Caleb looked toward the tall courthouse windows. Beyond the glass, sunlight had shifted across the American flag, leaving half of it in brightness and half in shadow. He had spent most of his life believing that service should speak for itself. Yet age had taught him that silence was often mistaken for surrender. May I say something, Your Honor? He asked. The judge nodded. Caleb placed both hands over the head of his cane. When Atlas retired, the Marine Corps transferred him into my care. I did not bring him home because of his awards. I brought him home because I made him a promise. His voice softened. But after my wife, Ellen, passed away 3 years ago, my health changed. I started losing my balance. Crowded rooms became difficult. Some mornings, I could not make myself walk farther than the front porch. Atlas lifted one ear at Ellen's name. Caleb noticed. So did the judge. Atlas began helping without being taught again. Caleb continued. He positioned himself beside my left leg. He brought my cane when I left it across the room. He woke me when my breathing changed at night. Dr. Amelia Grant documented those tasks and renewed his service recommendation every year. The attorney frowned. There is no report from Dr. Grant in the materials provided to my office. Caleb turned toward Margaret Vale. Her face had lost its careful composure. The judge followed his gaze. Ms. Vale, did the residents receive medical documentation from Dr. Grant? Margaret's hands folded tightly in her lap. We received a letter. When? Approximately 5 months ago. The attorney looked sharply at her. That letter was not included in the file you sent us. Margaret swallowed. The board believed it was incomplete. Judge Whitmore's voice remained calm. Did a licensed physician identify Atlas as necessary to Mr. Rowe's daily functioning? Yes. Did the board contact the physician for clarification? No. Did anyone evaluate Atlas in person before filing this complaint? Margaret's silence answered first. No, Your Honor. A faint rustle moved through the gallery, not laughter this time, but discomfort. The attorney lowered his papers. The shape of the case was changing, and everyone could feel it. Judge Whitmore asked the clerk to contact Dr. Grant's office and request the original letter. Then he turned another page in Atlas's record. A sealed envelope rested near the back, yellowed slightly with age. Across the front were the words, "To be opened only if Atlas's service is formally questioned." Caleb stared at it. I have never seen that before, he said. Judge Whitmore examined the military seal. It was signed by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Mercer. Caleb's breath caught. Mercer had commanded the evacuation at Outpost Mercy. He had retired years earlier and died the previous spring. The judge opened the envelope with deliberate care. Inside was a single typed statement and a smaller photograph. As he began reading, his expression changed from legal concentration to something deeply personal. The attorney watched him, uneasy now. After a long silence, Judge Whitmore looked toward Atlas and spoke with quiet reverence. This is not merely a record of what he did, he said. It is a record of who came home because he did it. Judge Whitmore lifted the smaller photograph from the envelope. It showed a line of civilians standing beside a transport aircraft beneath a pale desert sky. Some held canvas bags. Others carried sleeping children wrapped in borrowed blankets. Near the center stood a younger Harold Whitmore, not yet a judge, wearing the uniform of a Navy legal officer assigned to an emergency relief team. Caleb saw the recognition pass through his face before anyone else understood. The judge turned the photograph toward the courtroom. "I was there," he said. The attorney slowly sat down. Judge Whitmore looked again at Lieutenant Colonel Mercer's statement and began to read. On the morning of the Outpost Mercy evacuation, visibility fell below 100 yards because of wind and dust. Communications became unreliable, and the marked route to the airfield could not be confirmed. Military working dog Atlas repeatedly redirected the evacuation group away from unsafe ground and located a passable service trail leading to the western runway. His actions allowed 42 civilians and 11 American personnel to reach transport before conditions worsened. No one moved. Even the ceiling fan seemed quieter. The judge continued. Among those personnel was Lieutenant Harold Whitmore, United States Navy Reserve, who had remained behind to assist two families separated from the main group. The words did not sound like evidence anymore. They sounded like memory returning home. Judge Whitmore lowered the page. "I remember the dust," he said. "I remember being unable to see farther than a few feet. I remember a German shepherd appearing through it, then turning back every few yards to make certain we followed." His eyes settled on Atlas. "I never learned his name." Caleb's hand trembled against his cane. Atlas watched the judge with the calm attention he gave every unfamiliar voice, unaware that a room full of people had begun measuring him differently. The attorney rose with visible uncertainty. "Your Honor, I recognize the significance of this history, but personal connection may create an appearance of partiality." Judge Whitmore nodded. "That is a fair concern." His answer carried no anger. "The court will decide the legal matter from the evidence, not from gratitude. But the evidence now includes the complete record your client failed to review." At that moment, the clerk returned carrying a newly printed document. She handed copies to both tables and placed the original before the judge. Dr. Amelia Grant's letter was dated 5 months earlier. It described Caleb's reduced balance, episodes of disorientation caused by post-traumatic stress, and Atlas's consistent work as a mobility and grounding service animal. It also stated that removing Atlas could place Caleb at increased risk of injury and isolation. The attorney read the letter twice. His face lost its practiced certainty. "Ms. Vale," Judge Whitmore said, "why was this excluded?" Margaret stood slowly. "I thought the board would reject it." "That was not my question." She looked toward Caleb for the first time without distance. "I believed Atlas was too old to qualify. I made that judgment before speaking with his doctor." Caleb did not smile. He did not offer the satisfaction of blame. He only rested his hand behind Atlas's ear, where the fur had gone soft and silver. The judge turned to the attorney. "Did your office verify the resident's claims before describing this animal as a public threat?" The attorney's answer came quietly. "No, Your Honor." "Did you review his military file?" "No." "Did you observe his behavior before today?" "No." Each answer removed another layer of confidence from the room. The judge folded Mercer's statement and returned it to the envelope. "Then this hearing was built on assumptions," he said. "And assumptions become dangerous when they are dressed as facts." Atlas shifted closer to Caleb and placed one paw across the toe of his boot. Caleb looked down at him, and for the first time that morning, the old Marine's eyes shone with something warmer than endurance. The judge noticed. So did the attorney. What remained to be decided was no longer whether Atlas had earned respect. It was whether those who denied it were willing to face what they had done. For several seconds, no one spoke. The attorney stood beside his table with one hand resting on the papers he had used to question Atlas's worth, and for the first time those pages seemed heavier than evidence. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench. "Counsel," he said, "you addressed this court with confidence. Now I am asking for candor. Had you known the complete facts, would you have spoken about Atlas the same way?" The attorney looked toward Caleb, then toward the old shepherd resting against his boot. The answer did not come easily. "No, Your Honor." "Why not?" The attorney swallowed. "Because I would have understood that he was not simply present. He was serving." The words settled over the room with quiet force. Caleb's expression remained guarded. He had heard apologies shaped by obligation before. Some were offered to end discomfort, not to repair harm. Atlas, however, showed no suspicion. He watched the attorney with the patient gaze of an animal that had never learned pride. Judge Whitmore turned toward Margaret Vale. The same question applies to you. Margaret rose from the witness chair. The polished certainty in her voice had faded. I judged him by his age, she said, and by his size. I assumed Mr. Rowe was refusing to follow rules because he was attached to his dog. She looked at Caleb. I did not understand that Atlas was helping him remain independent. Caleb traced his thumb across the worn curve of his cane. You could have asked, he said. For words. Nothing more. Margaret lowered her eyes. Yes, I could have. Outside, church bells began marking the hour, their distant notes drifting through the courthouse windows. Atlas lifted his head at the sound. For one brief moment, Caleb remembered another bell, smaller and softer, hanging above the front door of the home he had shared with Ellen. Atlas used to wait beneath it every evening, listening for her car in the driveway. After she died, the dog continued waiting for weeks. Caleb had never corrected him. Grief, he had learned, sometimes needed a place to sit before it could move on. There is something else, Caleb said. His voice carried farther now. Atlas did not begin helping me because anyone ordered him to. After Ellen passed, I stopped sleeping. I stopped going to the dining hall. I told people I was tired when the truth was that I did not know how to live in a house that had gone quiet. His hand moved to Atlas's shoulder. He started bringing me his leash every morning. At first, I ignored him. Then one day, he stood by the door for nearly an hour. So I walked with him, half a mile. The next day, we walked again. That is how I returned to the world. The gallery remained still, but the silence had changed. It no longer carried judgment. It carried recognition. The attorney stepped away from his table and faced Caleb directly. His voice was no longer polished for argument. Mr. Rowe, I spoke about Atlas without knowing him. I used language meant to win instead of language meant to be true. I am sorry. Caleb studied him for a long moment. Then Atlas rose, crossed the small space between them, and stopped at the attorney's side. The young man froze. Atlas simply looked up and offered his paw. A quiet breath moved through the courtroom. The attorney bent down and accepted it with both hands. Caleb's eyes softened. He has always been better at forgiveness than I am, he said. Judge Whitmore looked at the old shepherd, then at every person in the room. Perhaps, he replied. That is the final service record we needed to read. Judge Whitmore waited until Atlas returned to Caleb's side before reaching for the written complaint. The old shepherd lowered himself beside the chair, one paw resting across Caleb's boot as though the courtroom, the accusations, and the years between them had all narrowed into that single point of contact. The judge reviewed the final page in silence. Morning light had climbed higher across the oak paneling, touching the American flag behind him and turning the gold fringe bright against the dark wood. This court finds that Atlas remains a qualified service animal, he said. The medical documentation is clear. His behavior in this courtroom has been exemplary, and the residents failed to conduct a fair review before seeking his removal. Caleb closed his eyes for half a breath. Atlas felt the change in him and leaned closer. Judge Whitmore continued. The complaint is dismissed. Hawthorne Veterans Residence is ordered to recognize Atlas's protected status, restore Mr. Rowe's full access to all common areas, and remove every warning issued against him in connection with this matter. Margaret Vale nodded slowly from the witness chair. The attorney stood with his hands folded before him, no longer trying to interrupt the silence between each ruling. The residence will also provide staff training on service animal accommodations, the judge said. Not because every service animal carries a military record, but because dignity should not require a medal before it is respected. A soft breath moved through the gallery. Caleb looked toward the bench. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Whitmore met his eyes. The law required this outcome, Sergeant Rowe. Gratitude is separate. He glanced at Atlas. Though in this case, I carry both. The attorney gathered the documents from his table, then paused. He removed the original complaint from the top of the stack and looked at the words he had prepared before learning who Atlas was. Dangerous. Unnecessary. Ordinary. He turned to Margaret. We should withdraw the residence's proposed animal restrictions entirely, he said. Margaret nodded. We will. Caleb heard them, but he did not celebrate. Victory had never sounded like applause to him. It sounded like a door opening without resistance. It sounded like being allowed to walk beside Atlas without explaining why. It sounded like returning home with one less thing to fear. Judge Whitmore lifted the small photograph one final time. "Mr. Rowe, may I ask what happened after Outpost Mercy?" Caleb's gaze drifted toward the faded image. Atlas completed another 7 months of service. Then his hips began slowing him down. The Corps approved his retirement, and I adopted him before anyone could change their mind. A faint smile touched the judge's face. Did he adjust well to civilian life? Caleb looked at Atlas, whose eyes had begun to close in the warmth of the sunlight. He stole a roast from the kitchen, his first Christmas home. Quiet laughter passed through the courtroom, but this time it held no cruelty. Ellen said it was the first thing he had ever taken without permission. She gave him half of it anyway. The smile faded gently from Caleb's face, leaving something tender behind. He slept beside her bed during her final week, never moved more than a few feet. Judge Whitmore lowered the photograph. Then his service did not end overseas. "No, Your Honor," Caleb said. "It only changed uniforms." The bailiff called the next case, but no one hurried to leave. Margaret crossed the aisle and offered Caleb the residence key card she had once threatened to deactivate. The attorney held the gate open. Caleb rose slowly, and Atlas moved into position beside his weaker leg. Together they walked toward the courtroom doors, not as a man rescued by a famous dog, and not as a hero collecting a debt, but as two aging partners carrying the quiet dignity of having stayed when leaving would have been easier. The courthouse doors opened onto a bright North Carolina afternoon, where the air carried the scent of warm pavement, cut grass, and rain waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Caleb paused beneath the stone archway while Atlas adjusted his footing beside him. The old shepherd's steps were slower now, but each one remained deliberate. Across the courthouse lawn, 3 men and 2 women stood near the flagpole. Caleb recognized the posture before he recognized the faces. Veterans. One wore a faded Marine Corps cap. Another held a cane much like Caleb's. They had heard enough through the open courtroom doors to understand what had happened. No one spoke. The Marine in the cap straightened first and raised his hand in a quiet salute. The others followed. Caleb stopped breathing for a moment. Atlas lifted his head, amber eyes moving from one person to the next. Then he stood a little taller beside Caleb, his silvered muzzle touched by sunlight. Caleb returned the salute. His hand trembled, but it did not fall. The attorney emerged behind them carrying his briefcase. He slowed when he saw the line of veterans. A few hours earlier, he might have walked past without understanding. Now he removed his suit jacket, folded it over one arm, and waited silently until Caleb lowered his hand. Margaret Vale came through the doors next. She approached Caleb with the residence key card still visible between her fingers. "The garden gate sticks after rain," she said softly. "I will have someone repair it before you return." Caleb studied her face. There was no defense left in it, only an awkward wish to begin again. "Atlas likes the east path," he said. "It is quieter there." Margaret nodded. "Then we will keep it clear." Caleb offered no speech about forgiveness. He simply accepted the small repair as it was offered. Sometimes mercy did not arrive as a grand apology. Sometimes it arrived as a gate that would open when an old man and his dog reached it. A light breeze moved through the oaks, stirring the courthouse flag above them. Judge Whitmore appeared at an upstairs window, still holding the faded photograph from Outpost Mercy. Caleb looked up and saw him place one hand against the glass. The judge gave no salute. He only bowed his head. That was enough. Caleb and Atlas began crossing the lawn toward the parking lot. Their pace was unhurried. Near the curb, Atlas stopped beside a patch of clover and looked back. The veterans remained by the flagpole. The attorney stood a few yards behind them. Margaret waited on the steps. For one quiet second, every person seemed connected by the same understanding. Honor did not belong only to the young, the strong, or the celebrated. It remained in tired hands that still kept promises. It lived in an aging shepherd who rose whenever his Marine needed balance. It appeared in the courage to admit a mistake before pride made it permanent. Caleb touched the worn leather collar beneath Atlas's fur. "Ready to go home, partner?" Atlas leaned into his leg. Together they walked on, carrying no victory banner and asking for no applause. Behind them, the courthouse returned to its ordinary rhythm. Ahead of them waited a small cottage, an open garden path, and one more evening beneath the Carolina sky. Some service records are written in ink and sealed away. The truest ones are written quietly, one faithful day at a time.